Greetings, and welcome to Michelle Speaks. If you hide it, you can't feel it. I am Michelle Portier, your host of the hour. I am a United States Navy veteran, life recovery coach, author, speaker, but most importantly, I'm an advocate, and I advocate for causes such as domestic and sexual violence, military sexual trauma, and mental health secondary to trauma because of my own experience. However, to date, I am here advocating and speaking and having a very candid conversation regarding racism being a systemic issue and the things that because of the current events that are going on here in the United States today. And so that is our focus today. And I think it would be remiss of anyone that has a platform or is an influencer not to have a conversation about what's going on in the media today. And so that is why we are addressing it, because at the bottom line, the very basic thing that we all desire in this world is human dignity and respect. And that was something that was not taken into account of, and that was actually violated. To me, it just shows the degree of human depravity that we've come to in this world, but also the lack of respect and the lack of value for um, a race of people because of the color of their skin. So today with me, I have a very special guest, Mr. Rodney Hurst, who is a civil rights activist, Black historian, and author. And so we're going to be having a totally unscripted, candid discussion today, addressing the things that need to be addressed. So without further ado, I want to thank you so much, Mr. Hurst, for agreeing to come on and talk about the things that are transpiring with George Floyd and the bigger issue behind that. So thank you again so much for
It's my
agreeing to
pleasure. My
and have,
pleasure, Michelle.
thank you so much. So, Mr. Rodney Hurst, can you share who is Rodney Hurst personally, professionally, and spiritually?
Rodney Hurst is a black male who, understanding who I am and where I am and what I am, started a journey understanding about being black in this country at age 11 in my American history class. And my teacher was a black male during these days of segregation, who was also the advisor to the Youth Council, NAACP. And as he talked with us about being black and about racism, and as he taught this American history class, he said to us, "Leave your American history book at home." Mr. Rutledge Pearson refused to teach us American history from the slanted and racist viewpoints of white textbook authors and historians. The book that we use in his class, approved for Negro students in the Negro division of the Duval County Public School System, circa 1955, only had two black names in that book,
Mm-hmm.
George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. And as important as they were and are, they are not the only blacks who made salient contributions to the development and the discovery of all of the tenets of America. So he started teaching us an American history from an inclusive point of view. He was also the advisor to the Youth Council, NAACP, and he said to us in the classroom, this black male American history teacher said to his black students, if you are not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. And he encouraged us to join the Youth Council NAACP, which I did at age 11 in this class. I started school when I was 5 and I got skipped. And as my pastor would say, favor ain't fair. So at age 11, I'm in his 8th grade class.
Right.
That was 65 years ago. And all this time, I have understood and dealt with and have been involved with fighting the struggle
Mm-hmm.
in understanding that the white Christian American institution of racism is America's original sin that came out of slavery. So we deal with that and understand that there is a constant struggle and it does not change. It's a day in and day out struggle. Racism is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and a lot of us don't understand or appreciate or realize that.
That is who you are personally. And I guess that encompasses everything because who you are is what you do, right?
Well, what that did, it led, after I joined the youth council, I became the president of the youth council at age 15 and led sit-in demonstrations here in Jacksonville at age 16. We sat in at the white lunch counters in downtown Jacksonville for 2 weeks. And 2 weeks from the day, we started on a Saturday. On August 27th, 1960, we were attacked by 200 whites with axe handles and baseball bats after white men in Confederate uniform passed out free axe handles in a park in the middle of downtown Jacksonville. Not only were we the targets of these white racist thugs brandishing axe handles and baseball bats, but any black person in downtown Jacksonville was swung on by these racists. And if you were white and you tried to protect someone black, then they also swung an axe handle or a baseball bat at you. The city, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'll hold it.
The city and city officials knew something was going to happen because there was an ex-FBI informant whom I met in 2000, who told me that the Klan held a meeting in a downtown Jacksonville hotel. And they decided they were going to start a race war. And this guy, as the FBI informant, infiltrated in the Klan, wrote up the report and gave it to his FBI handler, who in turn put it on the desk of the sheriff of Duval County. Jacksonville is consolidated now with one law enforcement unit, but then there was Jacksonville, which had its city police, and then there was the county of Duval, which had its sheriff's department and county patrolmen. He put this report, his handler put the report on the desk of the sheriff then, only to have that report later enter sheriff's lieutenants, who was a member of the Klan. But even with that, the city of Jacksonville's official knew something was going to happen because they had National Guard on standby in the city of St. Augustine, which is 35 miles away, and at a military installation called Camp Blanding, which is on the fringe of Jacksonville. But there was still no police protection downtown. There was no protect and serve. The newspaper and the television stations had blacked out all news about the city. And so when Axe Handle Saturday occurred, when we were attacked downtown, young people, 95% who were high school students, children, there was no protection there, no protection downtown. The civil rights movement focused and showcased and gave a platform to young blacks to deal with the tenets of racism. The civil rights movement represented emerging young black leadership in this country. In most of the sit-ins throughout the country in 1960, those students were college students in Jacksonville, high school students, but still understanding what racism was all about, understanding the disrespect, the hatred, and the evil, which are the core foundation legs of racism. So that represented my formative years in understanding who I am, what I am, and what racism is all about.
Mhm. So you painted a picture. You kind of set the background and painted the picture of what and how you experienced racism personally, and how that affected you, and how that shaped you and molded you into what you're doing now, which is still all these years later, fighting for the rights of, against the injustices of African American, and especially African American men. Though now it's, spilled over to African American men and women. In a conversation that we had yesterday, you made a statement, and I wanted you to kind of expound on that statement. And I thought it was very profound. You said, when you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression.
Right. The term racism means control.
Mm-hmm.
I tire of listening to white folk and black folk say, well, there are black races just like there are white races. No, there are not black races. Black folk are not in control of anything. White folk can exert their social, finance, and political control on me because of their numbers and because they can. That sets up the whole atmosphere of racism. I cannot do that. I have my prejudices, but I can't be a black racist because I'm not in control. So as white folk have lived with this control and their white privilege over the years, from slavery to Reconstruction, to the nadir of race relations, to Jim Crow and segregation and black codes, and all of these different ways that black folk wanted to make sure, that white folk wanted to make sure that these blacks that they kidnapped from Africa and brought to this country for their nefarious, obscene, and financially rewarding reasons, to keep us in a position of thinking of ourselves as less than. So when there is this journey, this fight for equal justice and equal rights and civil rights as guaranteed by the Constitution, white folk in this country, and especially in the South, have pushed back against that with all of the violence at their fingertips. Because as far as they are concerned, black folk are to be seen and not heard. And certainly we are not supposed to occupy any position of equalness to them. So because they have this thing that revolves around their white skin called privilege, and because they have this thing that revolves around who they are called racism, then they control and do everything that they want to do and as they see fit, and they don't have to share anything with anyone. And now that black folks say, hey, there's no such thing as separate but equal, and they win the Brown decision, and later on we get a civil rights bill passed, and later on a voting rights act passed in 65 and 68. So now black folk are saying, if we are citizens of this country, based on what the Constitution says and what you talk about in the Declaration of Independence, then there has to be some equality on the part of what we are allowed to do, along with you. And then white folk, because they have this thing about having to give up something that they don't want to give up and they don't want to share, then it appears as if they are being discriminated against and they are being oppressed. And as some white folk will tell you today, white folk are the most oppressed people in this country. Because all of a they have to deal with we the people.
Right.
All men are created equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They want to embrace the Second Amendment of the Constitution, which never dealt with them having the individual right to have more than 400 million guns in this country. But they don't want to deal with the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. They don't want to deal with the right of assembly. They don't want to deal with the right of free speech. So because they cannot have their proverbial cake and eat it too, they feel oppressed because they can't have things as they wanted, which makes the slogan, Make America Great Again, so insidious and racist because it says to white folk, who many are racist, it says to them, we want to go back to those days when we were totally in charge. And niggers were to be seen and not heard, and only seen when we wanted them to be seen. And that's what that means.
Thank you for expounding on that, crafting that out. So I have not heard what you stated earlier, with it being said that they are being oppressed per se. What I have heard, and I continue to hear, when African Americans are protesting peacefully and they are advocating that Black Lives Matter, the counteract is all lives matter, negating the fact that this issue is being highlighted internationally now because of the injustice that was done to a Black man. If all lives really matter, then what happened to George Floyd would not have happened.
Well, white folk, excuse me, white folk are very astute with coming up with defense mechanisms ostensibly to counter the quest and Black folk protesting for equal rights and civil rights. So when they say all lives matter as a cudgel against Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter says our lives matter too. It doesn't say that our lives matter instead of your lives. But white folk don't want to hear that. They want to hear, oh, there you all go again, using the race card, talking about Black lives, all lives matter. But white folk don't do that as a rule. They don't think of our lives when they think of other things. But it's convenient for them to now say all lives matter as a defense, as a comeback against all lives matter. It's and everything that is done whenever Blacks call out white American racism, then the defense mechanisms begin. And white folks certainly don't want to hear Black folk tell them what they have been guilty of during their lifetime and the creation timeline of this country. So everything that they end up trying to say and do revolves around a defense mechanism against human dignity and respect, and that kind of you are a man, you are a woman too, that they refuse to recognize. One of the cornerstones of racism is disrespect. And we see that played out every day. And the disrespect then moves to hatred and evil. And what those white politicians are able to say to those whites who have not made it. The reason you have not made it is that Black folk or Hispanic folk, but certainly Black folk have your jobs. You would have made it. You would have been a successful person instead of being the truck driver, whatever else that person is doing that they don't define as being successful. You would have been successful were it not for that black person or that black man or woman over there who took your job.
So then the blame pointed towards that community.
I'm sorry.
So then the blame is pointed towards other races other than
And it's always been like that. It's been like that since the end of the legal end of slavery with the conclusion of the Civil War. and I always like to point out that it was not a war between the North and the South.
Mm-hmm.
There was the United States of America. And because differing things were happening, and Abraham Lincoln, who was in opposition to slavery, was elected president, then 11 southern states decided that they would withdraw from the United States of America. They would secede. And when they seceded, they had to include in their secessionist papers why they seceded. And each of the 11 states said they seceded because of slavery. So those who say, oh, the South seceded because of states' rights and ethnic rights and heritage rights and all these other things, that's a lie. In their papers, that's what they included, slavery. So it was not, and then they formed a government called the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the United States of America and the Confederacy. Those were the opponents in the war. And the Confederacy, as an enemy government, was seeking to overthrow the United States of America, not the North Division of the United States against the South Division, the United States of America against an enemy government. And when the war was over and the South, the Confederacy lost, Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination, was both a supporter of slavery and a sympathizer to the South. And he gave a blanket amnesty, pardons, if you will, for all of Jefferson Davis and his cabinet and all of Robert E. Lee's generals and soldiers. So they were absolved of their criminal, treasonous, violent behavior to try to overthrow the United States of America by the executive pardon by the president. So white folk have carried that since slavery, that we are inferior because they refer to us as chattel with the nod and a wink wink from the white Christian community, and that we are to be docile and passive and do as we are told.
So even since the ending of slavery, and there was still racism that was going on, we have made some progress with the movements, with the likes of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all of that. However, we are still having a problem with racism because it is a systemic issue. So, and racism is learned. That's not something that is ingrained or is part of our DNA. It's something that's learned. And so with it being learned, it can be unlearned. So for those that are today, because of everything that's going on with George Floyd, which is now becoming an international thing because we see the support from abroad as well as here within the United States. How do we begin for somebody that is looking to be a part of the solution and not the problem, or just sitting on the sidelines not saying anything? How do we begin to infiltrate the system to address the racism from within the system? And how do we begin to do that? Because hatred is not going to change. Hatred begets hatred. Love is the only thing that's going to change that. And I don't mean the kumbaya come together love. I mean the love as far as holding those accountable for the things that they've done, the injustice that was done to George Floyd. And I see some of that. The charges for the officer, Derek Chauvin, I believe, was upgraded, and the other three officers were now charged. And I believe that's because of the outcry as a nation and internationally that's taking place. So how do we begin in our individual selves? If we don't know what to do, those that want to support, how do you begin to advocate for change from within?
The first thing is we have to understand. Well, first of all, I don't use the term progress, and I don't deny anyone else doing it, but I don't use the term progress because we are a long ways from progress. Malcolm X says progress is after someone stabs you in the back, just pulling it out a little bit, pulling it all the way out without seeking to heal that wound, that knife wound of progress put in your back. What we're seeing today is no different than what has happened in this country since the creation of this country, and certainly in the aftermath of the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. We are seeing the resentment, the hatred, the disrespect by white folk of black folk. There is no question that some of the things that have happened to black folk would not have happened to white folk. Walter Scott in North Charleston, who was stopped by the police, and for whatever reason, he jumped out of his car and started running. Running is not a capital offense. Mm-hmm. And a policeman knelt on one knee, took careful aim and shot him 4 times in the back, and then killed him and tried to put a gun as if to say it was self-defense. 2 policemen pull up to a park, and 13-year-old Tamir Rice is there in the park playing with a toy gun, which is an obvious toy gun, and without asking any questions or anything else, they shoot him within 2 seconds of arriving there. And of course, the Breonna Taylor and the Ahmaud Arbery and now the George Floyd, and before that, the Eric Garner and the Michael Browns, just a litany of folk. It shows how little respect there is on the part of white America for black lives, for my black hue of skin.
Well, there is no.
None at all. None at all. And when I hear folk talk about, we need to come together and do some things, when I see this hue and cry, as if this is something unique in the annals of this country. And yet the only difference in now and then was that there were no social media platforms to take pictures of what white folk and white police had been doing, how blacks were being brutalized then and killed and lynched then, which is what is happening today.
Well, it's being exposed.
Yeah, the thing that folk need to understand, that don't come up and say, I want to do something. Number one, do you understand what racism is? Do you understand your white privilege? Do you understand that you are a part of the problem? And until white folk begin to understand what the racism is and how racism has contributed to the undermining of this country, how racism led to electing a racist white president after 8 outstanding years of a black president, and white folk on the rebound decided, we're going to show you. Mm-hmm. And they elected a sexist, misogynistic, xenophobic, racist person who showed you who he was before you voted for him, and you voted for him anyway. So when we talk about how do we mend this country, how do we change things, how do we make America whole again, white folk have to understand that racism was created by them. I cannot change racism. Only thing I can do is fight it. And until white folk understand that they have to fundamentally change their own racism, then you're going to have the strife. Now, slowly, as has been determined with some of the demonstrations that we've seen, some white folk and others have joined black folk in protesting internationally, in addition to what we're seeing here in this country. But after the demonstrations are over with, then what do you do? And the first thing you have to do is have conversations about racism, because we can't change anything else until we admit to racism and work on ways that we deal with this systemic infrastructure, institutional, personal racism that exists in this country. And it didn't just start.
Well, I agree.
The murders that we're seeing right now did not just start.
And I agree with that.
We have a history replete. We have a history replete with blacks who have been lynched, both by the rope and by pistols and by firebombs and by sniper rifles and by the bombings of churches and homes.
And I agree.
All of those were lynching.
I agree that we have to have and we know the history of the racism and the bombs and things like that. But the things that are being exposed now because of the social media, they're being exposed for a reason. So then I want to speak to that. What you stated about our president now, that those that voted him in. Yes, there were those that voted him in. Among those that voted him in were also African American. So
I'm sorry, say it again.
Some of those that voted we have as president now, some of those votes came from African Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, black folk are not monolithic. Mm-hmm. Even during the civil rights movement, we all don't follow the same charge. Even during the civil rights movement, when we were when we were picketing, when we were marching, there were blacks who did not agree with what we were doing for varied and sundry reasons, not the least of which was it was upsetting their unique apple cart and relationship that they had with white folk. You have some white folk who did vote for Donald Trump, black folk who voted for Donald Trump, greatly in the minority. I think that black females voted for Hillary Clinton about somewhere around 95%. Black males was something like 89%. But still, black males and black females, notwithstanding the 5 to 7% or the 11%, was substantially more than white females who voted for Donald Trump, 54%. So you have a white female running for president, and white females talk about breaking the glass ceiling. And now you have a white female, very qualified, who can help break that glass ceiling and become the first female who is president of the United States, and you don't vote for her. So the question is, what kind of ally are you going to be for me? How can I trust that you're going to fight side by side for me as I deal with racism when you won't vote for someone who obviously was severely discriminated against because she was a female? So instead of voting for a qualified female, you voted for the sexist racist. So everything that you're getting right now, you allowed to happen based on how you voted for Donald Trump. So how do we change that? We change that with a sense of honesty and truth. And again, it all goes back to what degree white folk want to deal with their own racism. Because until they do, all they're doing is, when we look at what happens in our colleges and universities, how difficult it is for blacks to get into school, to colleges and universities, how difficult it is in some of our high schools, how blacks are treated in those high schools, how we deal with the ACT and the SAT exams that qualifies students to go to college, and as ethnically and racistly slanted as they are. That's part of the norm for white folk because they identify with that. When we deal with how our schools are being resegregated, when we deal with the fact that we now have segregation academies again that they call charter schools, that when we deal with in the educational arena, you see very few blacks that have positions of leadership. There are some here and there, but overall, we're dealing with a white structure of education, and an education that still refuses to give any support to black education and black history.
And again, that goes back to the only way to change and address racism is to deal with the system that the racism is embedded within. So in order to do that, we have to have the conversations, not just with us, but with us and but us as a people, like African Americans, how do we begin to change? We begin to get into those positions within the system to be able to be the voice, even if we are a minority in that to bring others in.
Some of our institutions, our churches, our fraternities, our sororities, our social organizations, our schools have refused to deal with some of these subjects. It's almost as if during this integration generation that everything is fine, that there are no problems.
When you say they refuse to deal with those topics or those, can you expound on them?
Yeah, you take any Sunday morning and survey many black churches. And some black churches are not talking about George Floyd. They're not talking about Ahmaud Arbery. They're not talking about Breonna Taylor. They're not talking about the numbers of the disproportionate numbers of a number of deaths by blacks during this pandemic, this coronavirus. They are not talking about things that impact folk in their congregation who look like them. And then when you ask them why, they say, oh, that's political. I'm not allowed to talk about political. No, it is truth and honesty. Jesus Christ was a radical.
Yes, he was. I agree.
Jesus Christ did things in that religious and historical book called the Bible that had never been done before, having women involved, healing the sick the way he did, beckoning the poor to come, talking about children, talking about women during the day. None of that was happening during that time until he came along. So when you say that you are getting outside of the tenets of religion and the teachings of Jesus Christ, if you talk about that, look at the Beatitudes. Look at a lot of things that Jesus talked about. And even though race was not a consideration then as it is now, there are other correlations that you get from dealing with the Bible that ministers, and I can deal with black ministers because I've been in churches when there was a national or a local or a statewide issue that you would have expected a black preacher to talk about in his pulpit, and he did not. So the question is why? Now, the question is, are you legitimately concerned with, if you talk politics, it could question or put your exemption, your tax exemption in jeopardy, or are you hiding behind the pulpit and the Christian cross? And if you are, you need to read Black Liberation Theology by the late great theologian James Cone, who basically said the same Jesus Christ and the same God that we worship as oppressed people is not the same God that racists worship. we have this thing that certain things should not be discussed in religion as if it is taboo, yet many in the black church won't even admit that Jesus Christ was black. If I deal with, if I ask anyone today, most people, where the Middle East is, very few can point it out on the map. And if I ask them, what does the Middle East mean? Very few people can explain that. Middle East is not a geographical term. The term Middle East is a political term. Because if you were not saying the Middle East and saying that's where the Bible takes place and that's where the Holy Lands are, and that's part of the area where Jesus Christ walked when he walked on this earth for those 33 years, then you would have to say the Bible takes place in and around the continent of Africa, which is where the Bible takes place. When the angel Gabriel, either in a vision or a dream, went to Joseph or appeared to Joseph and said, take Mary and Jesus to Egypt, and you stay there until I send for you, because Herod is killing the firstborn. So I want you to take Jesus and Mary and you, in effect, hide in Egypt. You can't hide a white, blue-eyed baby in Egypt on the continent of Africa. And Egypt has always been in Africa. It's never been in Europe, as some white folk like to imply that it is. So issues like that are issues that are not discussed in our churches. They are not discussed in our fraternities. We don't deal with how racist American history is and how we need to teach young black boys and young black girls that no one gave us anything, that we can take our rightful place for making salient contributions to this country. And until we begin to understand the respect and the legacy that we have, and then we begin to demand that respect from folks who are disrespecting us, we have to arm people with the knowledge of who we are before we can go to them and say, hey, you're not doing this or you're not doing that. You need to understand that legacy. And a lot of us don't know that.
I was about to say, to understand the knowledge of who we are, we first have to know who we are. And so to
Yes.
that end, again, the things that are happening now have always happened. It is now being exposed through social media. Where we are now is exposing the hearts of people that we thought to be our friends, our family. They are showing their hearts by their actions or inactions on how they're responding to this unrest, into the protests, into the looting, into the rioting, into the injustice that was done to George Floyd. So how do we begin to address it, to bring change, if you don't talk about it?
Yeah, well, you've got to talk about it. Communications is an absolute priority. I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid yet about some of the folk who are out demonstrating. It's good that they're out showing their opposition to the racism exacted on George Floyd by murdering policemen. But I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid based on what has happened the last 8 or 9 days. There is no prescriptive formula as to what a white person or a black person needs to do going forward. No one can write a map for you as to what you need to do. But one of the things, if you want to show and prove that you are honest about wanting some changes, you have got to decide to what degree you're going to seek out some things, to what degree you're going to deal with family members and friends who still use nigger and other racial epithets in their conversation? To what degree you're going to say to your white pastor that you want him to talk more about some of the issues that are impacting this country from his pulpit? In your schools, why are we not studying Black history in our schools as part of the curriculum? When you go off to colleges who are not exempt, why are colleges not including Black history and subjects about Black folk in their curriculum, which they purposefully have excluded? Because no one is making them do that. In these TWIs, traditional white institutions, you don't have a number of Black students who can demand that certain things happen. And until those Black students have some white students who are allies and some of these things can happen, then we're going to keep that cycle going of nothingness that has been going on in the colleges and universities for decades. To what degree you stand up and say no when everyone else is saying yes, that's an individual decision. But many times you have to understand first where this racism thing comes from. Why is there racism? Why am I being discriminated against by the color of my skin? There are excellent examples. There are a number of white anti-racists commenters on the internet, on YouTube. Jane O'Neill and Tim Wise just happens to be two of them, who are very excellent in dealing with the privilege and the white racism and the racism of white folk. So it has to start. You and I can do everything we can to change racism, but until white folk make that an understanding to make some changes, then it's going to be just the same soup warmed over. And I think that, again, there is no prescription. From the day that I started on my Black history and civil rights journey, I think I said to you before, that was 65 years ago.
Yes, you did.
The NAACP was founded in 1909. It was named NAACP in 1910. That's 111 years ago. And they have been working to put themselves out of business, dealing with racism and discrimination and bigotry. And they're no closer to doing that than they were when they were first organized as a result of a race riot in the North at that time, Northeast, Northwest. So it's not an easy prescription, but it's a marathon, and every day a person should be able to go to bed at night and say, I did something to fight the scourge of racism, the pathology of racism in this country. And a lot of times you can't spell that out as to how you do it, but you can join organizations. You can speak out at different groups. You can go to protests and rallies. You can take out memberships in different groups. You can engage a person who does not look like you to have conversations, honest conversations about race in your churches, in your social groups, in your colleges or universities, on the faculty with you, on the staff. If you really want to do some things, engage some Black folk for honest discussions about racism and white privilege and what happens to them from the time they get up in the morning, that Black person, to the time they go to bed. What a Black parent has, the conversations that Black parent, mother and father, have to have with their Black sons when they go out and if they encounter the police. White parents don't have to do that. Why is it that Black parents have to do that? And as obvious as it is, white folk need to understand that is part and parcel of the criminal injustice system which revolves around racism in this country.
So partly, I know there's no set prescription, but individually, how we can begin to help, or they can begin to help, is one, to understand the root, is what you said. And two, what we can begin to do individually, white and black, is to hold those accountable in their conversations. You know, when they're making the racial slurs and things like that, hold those accountable that are in positions that can affect change. Begin to fill those positions. I just wanted to point out some of the things that if people are asking, what can I do? Rather than sit on the sidelines and wait to see how it's going to fall. The one thing that I would say that we cannot do, white, black, no matter race, color, or creed, we cannot sit by and not do anything.
Yeah, and there are those who will.
Yeah.
There are those who stand on the sidelines like they do now, and they snipe and criticize and complain and do nothing. And yet there are those who are willing to make whatever sacrifice is necessary to fight this original sin in this country. You know, I when people come up to me and ask me, as they do, Mr. Hurst, what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
Then my response invariably to them is, well, what have you done thus far? What have you tried to do? Well, you know, I really don't know. What are you willing to do?
What are
Are
you
you
willing
willing?
to
Are you willing to join the NAACP? Are you willing to say to your family members, don't use the word nigger or jungle bunny around me? Are you willing to say to some of those staff members, your staff colleagues, that I think that I don't like that racist joke, and if you're going to tell it again, you aren't going to tell it about me, and I'm going to complain about your being racist in the workplace, or telling your children, your sons and daughters, your nieces, nephews, your grandchildren, that whatever you bring back from school to this house that's racist, I am not going to tolerate it. Saying to your pastor, saying to your Sunday school, saying to your Baptist Training Union people, we need to fundamentally do something so that we can start dealing with racism in this country. Now, that takes guts, takes sacrifice, because none of this is comfortable. Dealing and talking about racism is one of the most uncomfortable things that you can do. And the reason why we're no further along in it than we are is that in this country, white privilege and racism go hand in hand. And white folk are not prepared to give up anything, because if they do, then it will feel like oppression because they're giving up some of their privilege.
Well, that is exactly the reason, Rodney, why I wanted to have this conversation today, to talk about the uncomfortable things, to get people to start thinking about in their minds, what are you willing to do? What are you willing to sacrifice? Who are you willing to hold accountable, including yourself? Are you going to hold those accountable that are in your circle, that are not saying anything, that are straddling the fence? And so in order to begin to address the uncomfortable things, we have to talk about it. We have to bring it out in the open. So that is what we wanted to do today. And
that's great. That's outstanding.
And I charge those leaders, those influencers that have platforms, to begin having the uncomfortable conversations, not just within your group, the group of people that you know where it's comfortable, but for those that make it uncomfortable, because love is not always that kumbaya. It is holding those accountable and asking the hard questions. Why are you not studying anything? Why are you allowing this in the schools? Why are we not teaching Black history? Begin to ask the questions. Begin to ask yourself, what are you willing to do, and what are you willing to sacrifice?
Since the current wave of protests have begun, I bet you I've gotten almost 10 calls from people who want me to come and speak to their groups, either virtually or in a safe distance type circumstance, about racism, about explain to white folk what's going on. And just like you have heard, and I've heard before, what are some of the things that we can do?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the communications is the most important thing to begin with, because whether we agree to agree or agree to disagree,
You have to have the
then we are still communicating. We are setting up lines of communication. We're talking about cultural confrontations. It's just like with the protests. Folks are saying, right now I really support the protest, but the violence. Black folk are not monolithic. I don't know if some of the people involved in the violence were paid to do that or not. I don't know if all of the people, and they've shown on the internet that all of the people who are exacting the violence are not black folk.
Yeah, I've seen it.
I am not going to apologize for anything that happens out there on the streets any more than I'm asking white folk to apologize for Dylan Roof killing the 9 parishioners at Emmanuel Baptist Church, or Timothy McVeigh, who blew up a federal building and killed 193 persons. We have been dealing with violence in this country since this country took this land from the indigenous people called American Indians. So as horrific as violence is, let's talk about You want to talk about violence? Let's talk about the summer of 1919 and the Red Summer, when there were almost 40 race riots because of migration of many blacks that was caused by whites. Let's talk about 1921 and the race riot that decimated Black Wall Street. Let's talk about Rosewood in Florida. Let's talk about some of these other circumstances where blacks were burnt out and there was a riot. Let's talk about those things. Let's put some of these things in perspective. But we don't want to do that. This country always wants to selectively pull some things out to enable them to forget about why the people were protesting to begin with.
They don't want to do that, but we are in a perfect position now to do that.
So everyone wants to talk about it now, which is great, and my kudos to you for what you're doing, because your broadcast and things like this are what we have to put out there for people to see or not see, accept or not accept, but at least they're out there, and people who want to do something will internalize what you are doing, and even perhaps what some of your guests will say about what's happening. It has captured the conversation of this country right now, in addition to coronavirus, and it shines a spotlight on a racist American president who is enabled by a cabinet of racists. Whenever I talk about racism, white folk who are very uncomfortable using racist and racism basically say, why are you calling that person a racist? Because you are. When you are silent in the face of racism, when you say nothing and do nothing when you see racist acts, your silence and your compliance say to me you support whatever is going on.
No action is an action. Yeah.
Which makes you a racist. If I am with somebody and they commit a murder, then I am an accessory to that murder. Just like the 3 policemen are accessories to Darvin, who killed George Floyd.
And they're
So when you do what you do, which is nothing, you are accessories to racism. You don't have to say nigger. You don't have to wear a robe and put on a pointed white hood. But your saying and doing nothing makes you an accessory.
So with that being said, the question that I've posed to everybody listening, everybody that's going to talk, is what are you going to do? What are you willing to sacrifice? I want to thank you, Mr. Rodney Hurst, for coming on to have the candid conversation about racism and its
It's my
roots.
pleasure.
Um,
For some of your listeners and your viewers, go to YouTube. There's a 45-second bit on YouTube by Jane O'Neil, O''Neil, maybe two L's, but Neil. It's 45 seconds. And she starts off her presentation to a all white audience by asking them, how many of you would like to be treated the way blacks are treated in this country?
ONIEL?
Yeah, ONEIL, yeah. Jane O'Neil.
Any parting words for those that are listening or call to action? You know, if you want to get in contact with Mr. Hurst and read the book, the website is on the screen.
Yeah, one of the things I always say to folk, because it's a fighting racism is day in and day out. I tell folk that you can get tired of fighting racism, but you can't get weary of fighting racism. So get tired, go somewhere and re-energize, go up to the mountaintop, and then come back down and spend some more time in the valley.
Well, there you have it. That's the call to action for Mr. Rodney Hurst. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. I want to thank you again, Mr. Rodney, for
It was my pleasure.
This topic. I encourage you and I implore you, if you have not read Mr. Rodney's book on it was about more than a cook and a hot dog and a cook, please visit his website. It's across the bottom, rodneyhurst.com. Purchase that book, read it, learn more about it, and then find out what you can do within your community, within your sphere of influence. Start a group, start a conversation, and begin to act.
And a shameless plug, new book coming out next month called Never Forget Who You Are, Conversations about Racism and Identity Development. And you'll hear more about it. And Michelle, I'll make sure that I get in touch with you for further information on it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for listening and tuning in to Michelle Speaks With You, How That You Can't Feel It. We've been talking about racism being a systemic plague. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you missed it, make sure to enter the replay. You can find it on YouTube. It will be posted later on today. Take care, you all, and God bless.
God bless you.